Medieval castles weren't just big stone buildings. They were built to trick, trap, and stop enemies from getting in. Every part had a smart purpose. Some ideas were simple, others were sneaky, but all of them worked. Here are 10 clever ways castles outsmarted anyone who tried to attack them. The first trick started outside the walls. Moats were the original keep-out signs of medieval castles, except instead of a small wooden post, they were massive water-filled trenches that surrounded entire fortresses. These weren't just decorative water features where you could toss coins and make wishes. They were serious defensive barriers designed to make attackers miserable. Here's what most history books don't tell you. Moats weren't always filled with clean, sparkling water. Many castle owners weren't picky about what went into their moats. Some were just dry ditches that made climbing difficult. Others contained whatever the castle inhabitants dumped out their windows. Yes, including all their waste. Nothing says, "Welcome to our castle," quite like a moat full of medieval toilet contents. The average moat measured between 5 to 30 feet deep and 10 to 50 feet wide. Not exactly something you could hop across. This massive barrier made it nearly impossible to use siege equipment effectively. Try rolling a heavy battering ram through waist-deep water. Siege towers would get stuck in the mud, and ladders couldn't reach across the gap. Some particularly devious castle designers added wooden stakes hidden just beneath the water's surface. Imagine wading through sewage water only to be impaled on sharpened posts you couldn't even see. Many moats had sloped, muddy sides that became slippery death traps when wet, like a medieval slip and slide that ended with you being shot by archers. In winter, you might think a frozen moat would make crossing easier, but castle defenders would break the ice or pour hot water to create weak spots. One historical account mentions attackers falling through thin ice and then being laughed at by defenders who called them human popsicles. Even dry moats were dangerous. Defenders filled them with thorny plants, sharp rocks, and sometimes even deceased animal carcasses that spread disease among the attacking forces. Roughly 40% of siege casualties came not from direct combat, but from diseases contracted while trying to overcome castle defenses like these. As effective as moats were at keeping enemies out, sometimes the real danger wasn't what was in front of you. It was what was directly above your head. If you somehow made it across the moat, you'd face another clever medieval defense. After struggling through a castle's moat, exhausted attackers would finally reach what appeared to be safety under the gatehouse entrance, only to discover that medieval architects had planned a nasty surprise. Murder holes, those innocent-looking openings in ceilings above entrances and passages, turned seemingly safe spaces into deadly traps. Talk about the world's worst shower system. These strategic holes earned their grim name honestly. Castle defenders positioned themselves above these openings with an arsenal of unpleasant welcome gifts for unwanted visitors. Boiling water ranked as the most common weapon, not because medieval defenders were particularly cruel, but because water was always available and could be quickly heated. Medieval knights quickly learned that hot water heater problems had a whole different meaning when attacking a castle. Medieval defenders weren't picky about their ammunition. If it hurt when dropped on your head, it qualified for murder hole duty. Hot sand became particularly feared among attackers as it would slip into armor gaps and continue burning skin long after the initial attack. Some castles used rocks, which proved remarkably effective when dropped from 40 feet above. Nothing ruins an invasion like getting bonked on the head by medieval aerial bowling. Contrary to popular belief, boiling oil was rarely used. Oil was expensive and too valuable for cooking to waste on invaders. Historical records from Dover Castle show that during one lengthy siege, defenders dropped over 2,000 gallons of heated water, 500 pounds of rocks, and barrels of kitchen waste through their murder holes. Some unlucky knights got hit with last week's rotten stew, death by medieval leftovers. Murder holes typically measured between 6 inches to 2 feet wide, small enough to protect defenders, but large enough to aim properly. Many castles featured hidden murder holes that would only be revealed when attackers were directly underneath. The psychological impact often exceeded the physical danger. One medieval chronicle describes soldiers refusing to enter castles even after gates were breached because death reigned from above. Even the bravest knight would think twice about charging forward when the ceiling itself seemed determined to kill him. If attackers somehow survived the moat and avoided the murder holes, their troubles were far from over. The clever defensive features of medieval castles were just beginning to reveal themselves with each step deeper into enemy territory. A few months ago, I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancée got me one, and I have to say, I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly, I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60, and it's clear. This one is the best bang for your buck, with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you are on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Deeper inside the castle, spiral staircases presented yet another deadly challenge for invaders who thought they were making progress. These weren't just fancy architectural features to save space, they were carefully engineered death traps disguised as simple stairs. Medieval builders designed these spiral staircases with a specific clockwise turn as you ascended for one brilliant reason. Most people are right-handed. When defenders stood higher on the stairs fighting downward, their right arms had the entire open center space to swing their swords freely. Attackers climbing upward, however, had their right arms against the central column, severely limiting their swinging range. Talk about unfair home field advantage. It's like playing basketball with one team's hoop being twice as high. The narrowness of these staircases forced attackers to climb in single file, eliminating their numerical advantage. Most castle spiral staircases measured between 3 to 5 feet wide, with some defensive ones intentionally built even narrower at just 2 feet across. Archaeological studies show that defensive spiral staircases had higher and more irregular step heights. Some steps were deliberately built at different heights to trip up attackers who weren't familiar with the layout. Historical records from the Siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 describe how just 8 defenders held back over 60 attackers on a spiral staircase for nearly 3 hours. Left-handed invaders actually had a rare advantage in these situations, which might explain why medieval people were so suspicious of lefties. Oh, you write with your left hand? Planning to storm any castles this weekend? Some particularly devious castle designers added extra tricks to their spiral staircases. Hidden trapdoors could open suddenly beneath attackers' feet. Tiny holes in the walls allowed defenders to stab at climbers with thin blades. The steps themselves were often made of stone worn smooth by years of use, becoming dangerously slippery when wet, which they often were during attacks when defenders would pour water down them. Medieval knights probably dreaded staircases more than dragons. While spiral staircases presented obvious challenges to invaders, even those who managed to navigate them successfully often found themselves completely lost in the next defensive feature. Medieval castles became even more dangerous to attackers once they ventured deeper inside due to intentionally confusing layouts, fake doors, and hallways that led nowhere. Castle designers weren't just architects, they were masters of medieval misdirection who turned buildings into complex mazes. The layout of many fortresses deliberately confused invaders who didn't know their way around. Hallways would branch off in multiple directions, leading attackers deeper into areas where they could be trapped. Studies of medieval castle blueprints show that over 50% of castles had at least 3 fake corridors or passages specifically designed to confuse invaders. False doors ranked among the most devious tricks. These convincing-looking entrances might open into solid stone walls or tiny closets that trapped overconfident attackers. In Dover Castle, researchers found evidence of 6 different false doors, all designed to waste attackers' time or funnel them into ambush points. It was medieval clickbait. This door leads to the treasury. You won't believe what's inside. And then, it's just a broom closet. Secret passages gave defenders another advantage, allowing them to move unseen behind walls and appear suddenly behind enemy forces. Defenders could disappear from one room only to reappear in another, making it seem like the castle had more defenders than it actually did. Dead-end corridors often contained hidden arrow slits that allowed defenders to shoot at confused attackers who wandered in. These narrow halls might appear to lead somewhere important, but would instead end abruptly, leaving attackers exposed with nowhere to run. Some castles featured staircases that doubled back on themselves or led in circles. Bodiam Castle in England contains a staircase that loops around completely, potentially leading confused attackers right back where they started. Nothing says you're lost quite like climbing stairs for 10 minutes only to end up exactly where you began. Medieval castles invented the first Stairmaster workout. Think you found the treasure room? Enjoy the broom closet instead. Want the king's chambers? Here's a wall. Looking for the exit? Good luck with that. The confusion caused by these deliberate architectural tricks often bought defenders precious time to either mount a counterattack or arrange for reinforcements. While invaders struggled to navigate the castle's confusing interior, defenders had another deadly advantage lurking in the walls themselves. Have you ever tried to shoot a target while someone was throwing rocks at your head? Not easy, right? Medieval castle defenders had it much better thanks to arrow slits, narrow openings in castle walls that gave archers a huge advantage in battle. Arrow slits were precisely designed defensive features that allowed archers to shoot at enemies while remaining almost completely protected. From the outside, these openings appeared as thin vertical lines in the stone, barely visible to approaching forces. But from the inside, they widened significantly, giving defenders plenty of room to move, aim, and fire. The standard arrow slit measured only 2 to 4 inches wide on the exterior wall, but could be as wide as 3 feet on the interior. This clever design meant that attackers outside had almost no chance of landing a return shot through these narrow gaps. Trying to shoot an arrow through an arrow slit from the outside was like trying to throw a pebble into a soda bottle from across a football field. Technically possible, but mostly just frustrating. As castle design evolved, so did arrow slits. Early versions were simple vertical slits, but later designs included horizontal openings that created a cross shape, allowing archers to shoot at enemies below or above them. An experienced medieval archer could fire between 10 to 12 arrows per minute through an arrow slit. During a typical siege, a castle with just 20 archers could rain down over 10,000 arrows in a single day of fighting. Medieval armies didn't have safe zones, just going to die quickly zones, and going to die slowly zones. The psychological impact of arrow slits was almost as important as their physical danger. Attacking forces could never know exactly where the next arrow would come from, creating constant stress and fear. Imagine playing a deadly game of whack-a-mole where the moles shoot back and you'll understand why soldiers dreaded approaching castle walls. While arrow slits protected archers, castles needed additional defensive features for their main entrances. The main entrance to a medieval castle wasn't just a simple door, it was a deadly defense system featuring portcullises and drop bridges that turned gateways into traps. These heavy iron and wooden barriers were designed to slam shut at the first sign of trouble. A portcullis was essentially a heavy iron or wooden grate that slid vertically in grooves built into the gateway walls. Unlike regular doors that swung open, portcullises dropped down from above. Operated by a counterweight system, they could drop into place in less than 3 seconds, faster than most attackers could react. Medieval engineering texts describe portcullises weighing up to 2 tons. You know that feeling when an elevator door closes just as you're about to step in? Imagine that, but the door weighs as much as a car and has spikes on the bottom. That's a portcullis. Many castles didn't stop at just one portcullis. Dover Castle featured 3 separate portcullises along its main entrance tunnel, creating a deadly sandwich effect. Attackers who broke through the first barrier would find themselves trapped between 2 more portcullises, stuck in what castle designers grimly called a killing zone. Drop bridges worked on a similar principle, but served a different purpose. Unlike modern drawbridges that raise up, medieval drop bridges were designed to drop. Some were designed to fall outward, crushing any attacker standing underneath. The records from the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 mention how attackers spent 3 days trying to break through the castle's portcullis system before giving up and mining underneath the walls instead. You might break through the first gate only to get squashed by the second. Medieval castles were basically playing whack-a-night with their visitors. Even if attackers made it through these tough entrance barriers, they were not safe yet. Castle builders had more nasty tricks waiting for anyone who thought they had made it inside. Just when attackers thought they had successfully navigated the castle's defenses, they might discover the floor itself was a weapon. Hidden trapdoors and drop floors were among the most cunning tricks in medieval castle design, turning solid ground into sudden empty space. These sneaky traps came in several varieties. The simplest were basic trap doors, sections of flooring mounted on hinges that could be triggered to swing downward. More complex systems used sliding floors that moved sideways when a hidden lever was pulled. The most advanced designs featured counterweight mechanisms that could be triggered remotely. Castle builders placed these traps in strategic locations. Main hallways just past the entrance were popular spots, as were narrow corridors leading to valuable areas like the treasury or armory. The destinations below these trapdoors were equally unpleasant. Some led to simple holding cells where trapped attackers would be kept until defenders could deal with them. Others dropped intruders into deeper dungeons with no easy exit. The most brutal designs featured spike pits that ensured attackers wouldn't be causing any more trouble. Watch your step wasn't just polite advice in a medieval castle, it was survival instruction. Triggering mechanisms varied widely. Some used simple rope and pulley systems that defenders could operate manually. Others were pressure sensitive, activating when enough weight was applied to a specific stone. Historical records from the siege of Chateau Gaillard mention attackers who successfully breached the outer walls only to lose 20 men to a series of drop floors that deposited them into a sealed dungeon. Trapdoors weren't only deadly, they were also psychological weapons. Once attackers saw one man disappear into the floor, they became hesitant to move forward at all. This hesitation gave defenders valuable time to prepare counterattacks or evacuate important people. Good for thinning out enemy numbers inside the castle, drop floors became medieval crowd control, though significantly more permanent than just asking people to form an orderly line. Detecting these traps was nearly impossible. Floor stones looked identical to the surrounding area, and trigger mechanisms were often hidden behind walls or underneath rugs. Medieval castle floors were like a deadly game of the floor's lava, except the floor actually disappeared and the lava was sometimes replaced with spikes. While trapdoors dealt with enemies inside the castle, defenders needed ways to keep outdoor attackers at bay. This is where the next medieval defense tactic came into play. Attackers who managed to reach the castle walls faced another deadly surprise from above: boiling liquids and fire attacks. These scorching defenses turned the space around a castle into what could be called the world's most dangerous outdoor kitchen. Hot water was the simplest and most common liquid weapon used by castle defenders. It required no special ingredients, was always available, and could be quickly heated in large quantities during a siege. When poured from the battlements, it caused severe burns and turned metal armor into painful heat conductors. Sand, when heated to extreme temperatures and poured onto attackers, became a terrifying weapon. Hot sand had the nasty ability to slip through even the smallest gaps in armor, continuing to burn skin long after the initial attack. For medieval soldiers, it was like getting the worst beach day imaginable. All the sand, none of the fun, and everything was on fire. Contrary to Hollywood movies, boiling oil was rarely used as a defensive weapon. Oil was extremely expensive and far too valuable for cooking to waste on attackers. More common was pitch, a thick, sticky substance that, when heated and ignited, stuck to armor and weapons while continuing to burn. Castle kitchen leftovers became ammunition during long sieges. Boiling soup, cooking grease, and even spoiled stew were repurposed as weapons. Nothing says, "We didn't like your dinner invitation," quite like having last night's stew dumped on your head from 50 feet up. Perhaps the most psychologically effective liquid defense was simple sewage. While not heated, it spread disease through attacking armies and destroyed morale. Medieval armies didn't have hand sanitizer, and nothing ends an attack faster than soldiers who can't stop throwing up. Fire arrows with oil-soaked rags were used to set wooden siege equipment ablaze. Battering rams, siege towers, and covered approaches were all vulnerable to these burning attacks. While these scorching attacks were effective at keeping enemies at a distance, castle defenders knew that the real key to surviving a siege wasn't just about fighting off attackers. Large pantries stored carefully preserved food that could keep castle inhabitants alive for months while enemies starved outside. Food storage wasn't just a convenience in medieval castles, it was a critical defense strategy. Medieval castle defenders relied on basic preservation methods. Salt was used to preserve meats and fish, while smoking was another common technique. Grain storage formed the backbone of siege preparations, as wheat, barley, and oats could last for years. Records from Rochester Castle show it maintained enough grain to feed 200 people for 4 months. Nuts, dried fruits, honey, and cheese rounded out the medieval siege pantry. These foods were calorie-dense and lasted without spoiling. Honey never spoils. Archaeologists have found edible honey in ancient Egyptian tombs. Beer and ale stored better than water and kept morale up. During a siege, defenders might drink 3 pints daily, not because they were partying, but because it was safer than water. Many castles were built with access to wells within the walls. The well at Dover Castle reaches 250 feet deep, ensuring attackers couldn't cut off the water supply. If a siege lasted longer than expected, castle inhabitants got creative. Historical records mention defenders eating their horses, dogs, cats, and even rats. Medieval castle dining had a way of going from royal feast to anything that moves real quick. Castle gardens provided fresh vegetables during siege situations, and some castles kept livestock inside their walls. Food rationing systems made supplies last longer, with higher-ranking residents receiving larger portions. Calling the cook stingy took on a whole new meaning when your dinner portion determined whether the castle could hold out for another week. While physical defenses and ample supplies were crucial for surviving sieges, sometimes castle defenders had to rely on their wits when other options ran low. Medieval castle defenders turned to psychological tricks and fake defenses to fool attackers. These clever deceptions were often as effective as physical barriers, but cost nothing more than creativity. Dummy guards placed on castle walls made fortresses appear better defended than they actually were. Castle commanders would place helmets on spears and position them along the battlements to give the appearance of a fully manned defense force. From a distance, these fake sentries looked convincing enough to make attackers think twice. The movement of torches around castle walls at night created the illusion of active patrols. Even with just a handful of soldiers, torches could be moved in patterns that suggested many more guards were present. It was medieval special effects before CGI, just some guys running around with fire trying to look like an army. Fires lit behind arrow slits made the castle seem full of defenders. By placing torches behind the narrow openings in castle walls, defenders created shadows that gave the impression of many archers ready to fire. Castle defenders also used sound to their advantage. Loud horns, drums, or coordinated yelling created the impression of a larger defending force. During the siege of Stirling Castle, records mention defenders using drums throughout the night to suggest reinforcements had arrived. False banners from powerful allies raised on castle towers sometimes convinced attackers that help was on the way. By flying the flag of a feared military force, defenders could cause attackers to reconsider their plans. A lone castle defender once ended a siege by throwing a beehive at attackers. The attackers assumed the defenders had an unlimited supply of weaponized insects and promptly retreated. Medieval pest control was also medieval crowd control. Strategic exaggeration of food supplies convinced attackers that waiting out a siege would be futile. Defenders would display their last food supplies prominently to suggest they had plenty. A castle's reputation was like its Yelp review for invaders. 1 star, tried to attack, got hit with bees, would not recommend it. Medieval castles weren't just stone buildings. They were complete defense systems that used clever design, deadly traps, and smart tricks to keep enemies out and defenders safe.